The transport shuttle shook hard as it entered the docking bay of the massive warship called the Crimson Mandate. And Private Elena Vasquez gripped her seat straps tight while the craft settled down with a heavy thud. She took a deep breath and looked out the small window at the enormous hangar around her, where dozens of alien soldiers moved about their duties without even glancing at the arriving shuttle. And she knew right then that her life was about to become very difficult indeed. Elena stood at just 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with brown skin, dark hair tied back in a simple braid, and brown eyes that watched everything around her with quiet attention. She was not impressive by any standards that mattered to the warriors of the HFY Imperial Fleet. The HFY were reptilian creatures who stood 7 to 8 feet tall on average, covered in thick scales that ranged from dark green to deep purple, with powerful tails and claws that could tear through metal when they wanted to use them. They were born warriors, raised from hatching to fight and kill and conquer. When Elena stepped off the shuttle with her gear bag over her shoulder, every HFY in sight turned to stare at her with open disgust on their scaled faces. "What is that thing?" one soldier hissed to another, not even trying to keep his voice down so Elena would not hear him. "A human," his companion answered with a sneer that showed all of his sharp teeth. "The Coalition forced command to accept a few of them as part of the new alliance treaty, and it seems we got stuck with one of the weak little creatures." Elena kept walking, her eyes forward, her face calm and showing nothing of what she felt inside. She had known this would happen, had prepared herself for it during the long journey from Earth. But knowing something and living it were two very different experiences. A tall HFY officer approached her, his scales a dark shade of purple that marked him as high-ranking, and his yellow eyes looked down at her with such contempt that Elena felt it like a physical weight pressing on her shoulders. "I am First Officer Crixana," the officer said, and Elena realized with some surprise that this was a female HFY. "You will follow me to the commander for processing human, and you will not speak unless you are spoken to first. Is that understood?" "Yes, First Officer," Elena replied in a steady voice. Crixana turned and walked away without checking to see if Elena followed, her powerful tail swinging behind her in a way that forced Elena to stay several steps back to avoid being struck by it. Elena understood that this was intentional, a small humiliation to remind her of her place. They walked through long corridors filled with HFY, warriors who stopped their conversations to stare and whisper as Elena passed. She heard words like prey animal and soft skin and waste of resources, repeated over and over until they blurred together into a constant hum of hatred. The commander's quarters were at the heart of the ship, behind heavy doors that slid open to reveal a chamber decorated with weapons and trophies from countless battles. Skulls of various alien species lined the walls, and Elena tried not to think about whether human skulls might join them someday. Commander Vexrol sat behind a massive desk made from some kind of dark metal, and he was the largest HFY Elena had seen yet. His scales were black as space itself, scarred in dozens of places from old wounds, and when he looked at Elena, his red eyes held nothing but cold evaluation. "So this is what Earth sends us," Vexrol said in a voice like grinding stones. "I requested reinforcements, and the Coalition gives me a creature I could break in half with one hand." "With respect, Commander," Elena said carefully, "I am trained and ready to serve in whatever capacity you require." Vexrol slammed his fist on the desk, so hard that the metal dented under his strength, and Elena forced herself not to flinch even though her heart was racing in her chest. "You will speak when I give you permission and not before," he growled. "I have read your service file, human, and I know exactly what you are. A fauna management specialist from some backwater colony, assigned to handle animals like a common laborer." Crixana let out a hissing laugh from behind Elena, clearly enjoying the commander's words. "The Coalition thinks they can force integration upon the HFY fleet," Vexrol continued. "But I will not waste valuable warriors babysitting a creature who belongs in a zoo rather than on a warship. You will be assigned to sanitation duties until I can find a way to transfer you somewhere else. And if you cause any problems at all, I will make you regret ever leaving your planet." Elena nodded once, keeping her face blank even though anger burned hot in her stomach. She had graduated top of her class at the academy, had spent years working with the most dangerous creatures known to humanity, had earned the highest clearance rating possible for her field. And none of that mattered to these aliens who saw only her size and her species. What they did not know, what her official file did not fully explain, was that her specialty was not ordinary animals. Class 7 fauna management meant apex predators of the most extreme kind. Creatures that could kill a HFY warrior as easily as breathing. And Elena had not just managed them, but had bonded with them in ways that most species considered impossible. But she said nothing of this as she was dismissed from the commander's quarters and handed off to a lower officer who showed her to a tiny sleeping space barely large enough for her to lie down in. She said nothing as she was given a sanitation uniform and equipment meant for someone twice her size. She said nothing as the next 3 weeks became a constant test of her endurance and her patience. The crew of the Crimson Mandate wanted her broken or gone, and they worked hard to achieve one or the other. Her food was tampered with so often that she learned to check every meal for contamination before eating. Her equipment was sabotaged, so she had to repair it again and again. Her sleep was interrupted by false alarms and accidental loud noises outside her door. She was tripped in corridors, shouldered into walls, and called every insult that could be translated into her language. Through it all, Elena endured, because she understood something that her tormentors did not. Patience was not weakness, and silence was not surrender. And the creatures who underestimated humans had a way of learning hard lessons when they least expected them. She watched and she waited and she learned the ship and its crew. And she kept her anger locked away deep inside where no one could see it burning. Her time would come, and when it did, the HFY would discover exactly what kind of human they had been given. 3 weeks passed aboard the Crimson Mandate, and Elena Vasquez had learned every corner of the massive warship through her work, cleaning corridors and disposing of waste. The crew still hated her, still tormented her at every opportunity, but she had learned their routines and their secrets as well. She noticed things that others overlooked because they did not consider her worth watching. She saw the quartermaster, a fat HFY named Draxal, sneaking crates into unauthorized storage areas late at night. She saw coded messages being passed between certain crew members when they thought no one was paying attention. She saw fear in some eyes and greed in others, and she stored all of this information away in her memory for later use. On the 23rd day of her assignment, Elena was cleaning the main cargo bay when she noticed something strange. A crate of thermal charges, military explosives worth a fortune on the black market, had been moved from its proper location to a shadowy corner near the waste disposal chutes. She checked the access logs on a nearby terminal and saw that the crate had been moved 3 hours ago by someone using falsified credentials. This was theft, clear and simple, and Elena knew she had to report it to the commander immediately. But before she could leave the cargo bay, alarms began to wail throughout the ship, and a squad of HFY warriors burst through the doors with weapons drawn and pointed directly at her. "Do not move, human," the squad leader shouted as he approached her with hatred burning in his yellow eyes. Elena raised her hands slowly, confusion and fear mixing in her chest. "What is happening? What have I done?" First Officer Crixana walked through the squad of warriors with a smile on her scaled face that made Elena's blood run cold. She was holding a datapad that she waved in front of Elena like a trophy. "Thermal charges have gone missing from secure storage," Crixana announced loudly so everyone in the cargo bay could hear, "and the access logs show that you, human, were the last one to handle them. That is impossible, Elena said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. I discovered that the crate was moved, yes, but I did not move it myself, and I was about to report the theft when you arrived. Crixana laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. A likely story from a likely thief. The evidence is clear, and your guilt is beyond question. More crew members were gathering now, drawn by the commotion, and Elena could see excitement in their eyes. They have been waiting for something like this, an excuse to get rid of her once and for all. Commander Vex Roll arrived minutes later, his massive form pushing through the crowd like a ship through water, and his red eyes locked onto Elena with a fury that made her take an involuntary step backward. I should have known, he growled as he circled her slowly, his tail sweeping the floor behind him. Humans are weak, humans are dishonest, and humans are unworthy of the uniform you disgrace with your presence. Sir, I did not steal anything, Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady. The access logs have been falsified. Someone is framing me, and if you would just investigate properly, you would see the truth. Silence. Vexrol roared so loud that Elena felt the sound in her bones. I do not care about your truth or your lies. I have wanted you gone from my ship since the moment you arrived, and now I have the excuse I need. Crixana stepped forward with that terrible smile still on her face. Commander, if I may make a suggestion. We've been looking for a way to test the new specimens in the Volkesh pit, and a live feeding would be most educational for the crew. A ripple of dark excitement passed through the gathered Kethvori, whispers and hisses of anticipation that made Elena's stomach clench with sudden terror. She had heard stories of the Volkesh pit during her weeks aboard the ship, whispered tales of a deep chamber where condemned prisoners were thrown to starving beasts for the entertainment of the crew. No one had ever survived the pit, not in the entire history of the Kethvori tradition. Commander Vexrol bared his fangs in a wide smile. An excellent suggestion, First Officer. Let the human face the consequences of her theft in the old way, and let the crew witness what happens to those who steal from the Kethvori fleet. Elena opened her mouth to protest, to argue, to plead for a fair trial. But before she could speak a single word, 4 massive warriors grabbed her arms and lifted her off her feet like she weighed nothing at all. She struggled against their grip, kicking and twisting, but she might as well have been fighting against stone for all the good it did. The Kethvori were simply too strong, and she was simply too small. As they dragged her through the corridors toward the lower decks, crew members lined the walls to watch and jeer, throwing insults and sometimes objects at her as she passed. Elena felt their hatred washing over her like a physical force. But beneath her fear, she also felt something else burning in her chest. Anger, hot and fierce, was building inside her where she had kept it locked away for 3 long weeks. They had framed her for a crime she did not commit. They had denied her any chance to defend herself. And now they were going to throw her to monsters for their own amusement. The lift that descended to the Volkesh pit was old and rusted, groaning under the weight of Elena and her guards as it dropped deeper and deeper into the ship. The air grew colder and carried strange smells that triggered ancient instincts in the back of her brain, warning her of danger ahead. When the lift reached the bottom, the guards threw Elena forward into darkness, and she hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. Behind her, the lift rose back up with a screech of metal, leaving her alone in the shadows. Crixana's voice echoed down from somewhere high above. Die now, chicken. Die screaming, like your species deserves. Laughter followed, the cruel laughter of hundreds of Kethvori warriors gathering on observation platforms around the rim of the pit, eager to watch the soft little human be torn apart. Elena lay on the cold floor for a moment, catching her breath, feeling the stone beneath her palms. Then she heard it, a sound that would have frozen the blood of anyone who did not know what they were dealing with. A low rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground itself, followed by the heavy thud of massive footsteps approaching through the darkness. She was not alone in the pit. Elena pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, then slowly rose to her feet. Her eyes were adjusting to the dim emergency lighting now, and she could see the shape of the chamber around her, a massive cylinder with walls too high and too smooth to climb. And there, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the pit, were the creatures that were supposed to kill her. 3 of them, each one more terrifying than anything the Kethvari had ever faced on their own. And Elena felt her heart racing as she recognized exactly what species they were. This was bad, very bad indeed, but perhaps not in the way that everyone watching from above expected. The creatures that emerged from the darkness were called Thresher Kings, and Elena Vasquez recognized them immediately because she had spent 3 years of her life working with their species on the 40 Kepler 7 Predator Sanctuary. They were massive beasts, standing 4 meters tall at the shoulder, with 6 powerful legs that ended in claws, capable of tearing through starship hulls. Their bodies were covered in biometallic armor plates that gleamed dull silver in the red emergency lighting. Their heads were broad and flat, with jaws that could bite through anything and 6 amber eyes that glowed with predatory intelligence. The largest of the 3 was a scarred male, his armor plates marked with the evidence of many battles, and he was looking directly at Elena with an intensity that would have terrified anyone who did not understand his species. On the observation platforms high above, hundreds of Kethvari warriors leaned forward with eager anticipation, waiting for the slaughter to begin. They expected screaming, they expected blood, and they expected to watch the weak little human torn apart in seconds. What they got was something very different. Elena did not run, because running from a Thresher King was the worst thing a person could do. Their hunting instinct would kick in immediately, and no creature in the galaxy could outrun them once they decided to chase. She did not scream, because loud noises would trigger their defensive aggression, making them see her as a threat to be eliminated rather than prey to be considered. Instead, she stood perfectly still and lowered her gaze slightly, not looking directly into the scarred male's eyes, but not looking away completely either. This was the posture of respect, not submission, and it was the first thing every Class 7 handler learned during their training. The scarred male paused in his approach, his massive head tilting to one side as he studied this strange small creature who was not behaving like prey. Elena clicked her tongue 3 times in a specific rhythm, a greeting call that she had learned during her years at the sanctuary. It was not language exactly, but it carried meaning that Thresher Kings could understand, a signal that said, "I am not afraid and I am not a threat." The observation platforms had fallen completely silent, every Kethvari staring down in confusion at what they were witnessing. Elena slowly raised her hand to the side of her head and pressed a small spot behind her ear. There was a tiny implant there, a neural link transponder that was standard equipment for anyone who worked with apex predators, and she felt it activate with a faint hum that vibrated through her skull. The transponder did not give her the ability to control the Thresher Kings or to read their minds. What it did was much more subtle and much more powerful. It allowed her to project calm, to broadcast her emotional state in a way that predators could sense and respond to. "Easy, big guy," Elena said softly, her voice carrying subsonic frequencies that the Kethvari could not hear. "I know you are hungry. I can see it in the way you are moving. I know you are scared too, even though you would never admit it, because this place is strange and cold and wrong." The scarred male took another step forward, but slower now, more curious than aggressive. Elena could see the signs of abuse on all 3 Thresher Kings now that they were closer. Their armor plates were dull instead of gleaming, a sign of poor nutrition. Their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, suggesting they had been drugged recently. and there were marks on their bodies where shock prods had been used to force them into compliance. Rage burned in Elena's chest, but she kept it locked away where the predators could not sense it. Anger would only frighten them, would make them see her as a danger. "They hurt you, did they not?" She continued in that same soft voice. "They starved you and drugged you and beat you because they wanted to make you into monsters for their entertainment. But I see what you really are, and you are not monsters at all." She took a slow step forward, and the crowd above gasped in shock. The scarred male could have killed her in that moment, could have lunged forward and ended her life with a single snap of his massive jaws, but he did not. Instead, he lowered his head slightly and made a sound that Elena had heard many times before at the sanctuary. It was a questioning sound, a vocalization that young Thresher Kings made when they encountered something new and did not know whether to fear it or trust it. "That is right," Elena said gently, taking another slow step. "I am not going to hurt you, and I am not afraid of you. I have worked with your kind before, big guy, and I know that you are not the mindless killers these aliens think you are." The other two Thresher Kings, both females slightly smaller than the scarred male, had moved up to flank him on either side. They were watching Elena with those 6 glowing eyes, and she could see intelligence in their gaze. Real thinking minds that were trying to understand what was happening. Elena reached out her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, and held it in the air in front of her. This was the trust gesture, the invitation that a handler offered when they wanted a Thresher King to accept them. The seconds stretched out like hours as the scarred male studied her hand, sniffing the air, processing the scents and the sounds and the signals that Elena was broadcasting through her neural link. Then, slowly, carefully, he moved forward and pressed his massive snout against her palm. His armor plates were cool to the touch, and Elena could feel the vibration of his breathing through her skin. He was so close that he could have killed her with a single twitch of his head, but instead, he was trusting her, accepting her, recognizing her as something other than prey. "Good boy," Elena whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Good boy, I've got you now, and I'm not going to let them hurt you anymore." She began to run her hand along his snout, finding the spots where the armor plates met and the skin beneath was sensitive. Thresher Kings loved being scratched in those spots, and she heard the scarred male begin to purr, a deep rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath her feet. The two females moved closer as well, nudging at Elena with their snouts, wanting the same attention. She laughed softly and reached out to touch them too, running her hands over their massive heads while they made sounds of contentment. On the observation platforms, Commander Vex Rahl was gripping the railing so hard that his claws had torn deep gouges into the metal. His red eyes were wide with disbelief, and his jaw hung open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Impossible," First Officer Crixana whispered beside him, her voice trembling. "The beasts were starved for days. They should have attacked immediately. This cannot be happening." But it was happening, right in front of their eyes, and nothing in their experience had prepared them for it. Elena Vasquez, the weak little human they had condemned to death, was standing in the middle of 3 apex predators who should have torn her apart, and they were treating her like a long-lost friend. She looked up at the observation platforms, at the hundreds of shocked faces staring down at her, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she allowed herself to smile. The Kethvari had wanted to break her, had wanted to watch her die screaming, but they had made a terrible mistake. They had thrown her into a pit with creatures that humans understood better than any other species in the galaxy. They had given her weapons instead of executioners, and now they were beginning to realize just how badly they had miscalculated. Elena Vasquez stood in the center of the Volkesh pit with her hand resting on the scarred male's massive head, and she could feel the entire ship holding its breath as hundreds of Kethvari warriors stared down at her in stunned disbelief. The three Thresher Kings had arranged themselves around her in a protective formation, their bodies positioned so that any attack from above would have to go through them first. This was pack behavior, the way that Thresher Kings protected their alpha, and Elena felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized what it meant. They had accepted her, not just as a non-threat, but as their leader in the span of a few minutes. It was a bond that some handlers worked years to achieve, but Elena had done it before with other Thresher Kings at the sanctuary, and she understood why it happened so quickly. These poor creatures had been abused and starved and drugged until they were desperate for someone to trust, for anyone who would treat them with kindness instead of cruelty. The HFY had broken them in their attempt to make them into monsters, and in doing so, they had made them hungry for exactly what Elena offered. She patted the scarred male's snout one more time, then turned to look up at the observation platforms. She could see Commander Vexrol and First Officer Crixana near the front, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear that gave her a deep sense of satisfaction. "You wanted me dead," Elena called out, and her voice echoed off the walls of the pit and carried clearly to every ear listening. "You framed me for a crime I did not commit. You denied me any chance to defend myself, and you threw me the creatures that you believed would tear me apart for your entertainment." The scarred male rumbled behind her, sensing her anger, and Elena took a breath to calm herself before continuing. "But you made a mistake, a very big mistake, because you did not bother to learn anything about humans before you decided we were weak and worthless." She climbed onto the scarred male's lowered head, and he lifted her up smoothly as she settled onto his broad back. Now she was riding him like a queen on a throne of teeth and armor, and she could see the HFY warriors shrinking back from the railing as the Thresher King raised her to their level. "My file said that I was a fauna management specialist," Elena continued. "You laugh at that title. You called me a zookeeper. You treated me like I was nothing because I worked with animals instead of carrying weapons into battle." She stroked the scarred male's neck, feeling his purr vibrate through her whole body. "What you fail to understand is what kind of animals I worked with. The classification on my file was Class 7, which is the highest danger rating that exists for xenobiological work. It means apex predators, the most dangerous creatures known to any species in the galaxy." Crixana's scales had gone pale, the purple fading to a sickly gray as understanding began to dawn on her face. "I spent 6 years at the Kepler 7 Predator Sanctuary," Elena said. "I bonded with Thresher Kings, with Void Stalkers, with crystalline raptors and plasma hounds, and a dozen other species that your people consider untamable. I earned the trust of creatures that could kill a squad of HFY warriors without breaking a sweat, and I did it through patience and kindness and respect." The scarred male beneath her let out a roar that shook dust from the ceiling, and the two females echoed him, their combined voices creating a wall of sound that made the observation platforms tremble. "You see monsters when you look at these creatures," Elena continued once the roaring stopped. "You see weapons, tools to be used and discarded, beasts to be beaten into submission and starved until they are mad with hunger. But I see something different, because humans have always seen something different." She pointed directly at Crixana, and the first officer actually flinched backward from a human's gesture for the first time in her life. "I see animals that have been hurt and frightened and abused by people who do not understand them. I see intelligent beings who are capable of trust and loyalty, and even love if they are treated with respect. And I see victims of cruelty that I am now going to protect." Commander Vexrol finally found his voice, though it came out weaker than his usual commanding roar. "This changes nothing, human. You are still a prisoner, and you will still face justice for your crimes." Elena laughed, and the sound was bitter and cold. "My crimes? You mean the theft that I did not commit, the theft that I was about to report before your warriors arrested me. Let me tell you something about that theft, Commander." She had spent 3 weeks watching and learning, and now it was time to use that knowledge. Your quartermaster, Draxel, has been running a black market operation for months. He steals valuable supplies from the ship's cargo and sells them to pirates and smugglers at secret meeting points. The thermal charges that went missing were just the latest shipment in a very profitable operation. Murmurs spread through the crowd, and Elena saw several warriors exchange nervous glances. I noticed the signs during my sanitation work, because when everyone thinks you are worthless, they stop being careful around you. I saw Draxel moving crates at night. I saw coded messages being passed between his accomplices, and I was gathering evidence to bring to you, Commander, when I was arrested. Vexrol's red eyes narrowed. You expect me to believe the word of a human over my own quartermaster? I expect you to investigate, Elena replied. Check the secondary cargo hold, Bay 17, behind the false wall panel. That is where Draxel has been storing the stolen goods before they are transferred to his buyers. You will find the thermal charges there, along with plenty of other evidence. She leaned forward on the scarred male's back, her eyes locked with Vexrol's. And while you are investigating, you might want to look into who has access to the feeding schedules for the Volkesh pit. Someone has been starving these creatures and drugging them to make them more aggressive, preparing them to be sold to fighting arenas. That is another profitable operation that someone on your ship has been running behind your back. The scarred male growled again, and Elena felt his muscles tense beneath her. These Thresher Kings told me a lot about how they have been treated, through their behavior and their body language and the marks of abuse on their bodies. Someone has been profiting from their suffering, and I am willing to bet that person is the same one who tried to frame me for theft. Commander Vexrol stared down at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he turned to one of his officers. Take a squad to Bay 17, he ordered in a voice that allowed no argument. Search for the hidden compartment the human described, and bring me whatever you find. Then he looked at Elena again, and there was something new in his eyes, something that might have been the beginning of respect. If you are wrong, human, then your death will be even slower than what the pit would have given you. Elena smiled. I am not wrong, Commander. I have been watching your crew for 3 weeks, and I know exactly who's been betraying your trust. Now they would see what happened when they underestimated a human. The squad that Commander Vexrel sent to Bay 17 returned within the hour, and they brought with them everything Elena Vasquez had promised they would find. The hidden compartment behind the false wall panel contained not only the missing thermal charges, but also crates of stolen weapons, medical supplies, navigation data chips, and enough evidence to prove that Quartermaster Draxel had been running his black market operation for nearly a year. When the warriors dragged Draxel before Commander Vexrol in chains, the fat Kethvari was already crying and begging for mercy, confessing to everything in a desperate attempt to save his own scales. The human is right about all of it. Draxel wailed as he knelt on the deck. I stole the supplies. I falsified the access logs to frame her. I was going to sell the thermal charges to a pirate captain at our next supply stop. Please, Commander, I will tell you everything. Just spare my life. Vexrol stood over his former quartermaster, with disgust twisting his scarred face. And the creatures in the Volkesh pit? The starvation, the drugs, the abuse? Draxel nodded frantically. Yes, that was part of the operation too. Aggressive beasts sell for higher prices at the fighting arenas, and I had buyers lined up who would pay a fortune for Thresher Kings that had been made mad with hunger. It was just business, Commander. Nothing personal. The cargo bay fell silent as every warrior present processed what they had just heard. Draxel had not only stolen from the ship, but had corrupted one of their most ancient traditions, turning the Volkesh pit from a place of honorable execution into a breeding ground for profit. And he had tried to murder an innocent human to cover up his crimes. Elena was still in the pit when all of this happened, but workers had lowered speakers so she could hear every word of the confession. She sat on the scarred male's back with her arms wrapped around his thick neck, and she allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. The cargo lift descended to bring her up, but there was a problem that no one had anticipated. The Thresher Kings refused to leave her side. When warriors tried to separate Elena from the creatures, all three of them began to growl and snarl, their armor plates bristling and their 6 eyes glowing with protective fury. It became very clear very quickly that any attempt to take Elena away from them would result in a lot of dead Kethvari. "They have bonded with her," one of the ship's science officers observed with amazement in his voice. "I have read about this phenomenon but never believed it was possible. The creatures have accepted the human as their pack leader, and they will not be separated from her now." Commander Vex Rahl watched as Elena rode the scarred male out of the cargo lift and onto the main deck, the two females walking on either side like bodyguards. Crew members scrambled to get out of the way, pressing themselves against walls and diving into corridors to avoid the massive predators. "Well, human," Vex Rahl said when Elena finally came to a stop in front of him, "it seems you have created quite a situation for me. I cannot execute you now that your innocence has been proven, but I also cannot have 3 Thresher Kings wandering freely through my ship." Elena slid down from the scarred male's back and landed lightly on her feet. She was still tiny compared to the Kethvari around her, but something had changed in the way they looked at her. "I have a suggestion, Commander," she said. "These creatures need proper care, proper feeding, and proper handling. I am the only one on this ship who knows how to provide those things. Make me responsible for them. Give me the resources I need to take care of them, and I promise they will not cause any trouble." Crixana stepped forward with anger still burning in her yellow eyes. "You expect us to reward you after everything that has happened. You should be grateful that we are not throwing you back in the pit." The scarred male's head swung toward Crixana, and he let out a growl that made her stumble backward with fear. "Easy, big guy," Elena said softly, touching his snout. "She is not worth it." The Thresher King settled down, but his 6 eyes never left Crixana. And the first officer seemed to realize for the first time just how close she was standing to creatures that could kill her before she could blink. Commander Vex Rahl was silent for a long moment, considering his options. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Contact Coalition Command," he ordered one of his officers. "Inform them that Private Vasquez has been cleared of all charges and that we are requesting a change to her assignment. She will no longer serve in sanitation." Elena felt hope rising in her chest. "What will my new assignment be?" Vex Rahl looked at her with those deep red eyes, and she saw something there that she had never expected to see from a Kethvari warrior. It was respect, genuine respect, earned through her actions. "Chief Xenofauna Specialist," he said. "You will be responsible for the care and management of all exotic creatures aboard this vessel, including your 3 new friends there. The Thresher Kings will be classified as bonded military assets under your direct command." Elena could not help the smile that spread across her face. "Thank you, Commander." "Do not thank me yet," Vex Rahl warned. "You have made enemies on this ship, and not all of them are as obvious as Draxel was. Watch your back, human, because there are those who will never accept what happened here today." He glanced at Crixana as he spoke, and the first officer's scales flushed with barely contained rage. "I have been watching my back for 3 weeks," Elena replied calmly. "I think I can manage a little longer." She turned and began walking toward the quarters that had been assigned to her, and the 3 Thresher Kings followed like loyal hounds, their massive bodies clearing a path through the crowded corridors. Crew members watched her pass with new expressions on their faces. Some showed fear, some showed confusion, but many showed something that looked almost like admiration. Word of what had happened in the Volkesh pit spread through the ship like wildfire. And by the next day, every HFY aboard the Crimson Mandate knew the story of the human who had tamed untamable beasts with nothing but patience and kindness. They had called her weak, had called her prey, had called her a worthless addition to their warrior crew. But she had walked into a pit of death and walked out again with monsters at her side. The official report that went back to Coalition Command contained a recommendation that was unprecedented in the history of the HFY fleet. It suggested that more humans be assigned to work with dangerous xenofauna, because their species seemed to possess abilities in this area that other races simply did not understand. Years later, when Elena Vasquez had risen to become the Coalition's leading expert on predator species, she would often tell the story of her first weeks aboard the Crimson Mandate. "The aliens did not understand us," she would say with a smile. "They saw our small bodies and our soft skin, and they assumed we were weak. But humans are not dangerous because of our teeth, or our claws, or our venom." She would stroke the head of the scarred male, now old and gray, but still loyal after all those years. "We are dangerous because we figured out how to make friends with the creatures that have all of those things. And that is a power that no other species in the galaxy has ever truly understood." The HFY learned that lesson in the Volcash pit, and they never forgot it again.